Okay, this is my favorite lecture in this course because there are so many blog posts and videos about repositories, and many of them conflict with each other, which made me confused about the repository pattern for a long time. So, in this lecture, I'm going to explain clearly what repository is and what it is not, why and if we need it, and address some of the misconceptions about repositories. So, what is the repository pattern? I'm going to start with a definition from Martin Fowler's book, Patterns of Enterprise Application Architecture. Repository mediates between the domain and data mapping layers, acting like an in-memory collection of domain objects. I've highlighted in-memory collection in this phrase because that's the key here. So what are the benefits of the repository pattern? The first one, again based on Martin Fowler's book, is that it minimizes duplicate query logic. So imagine in a few different places in our application, we need to get the first 5 top-selling courses in a given category. Without the repository pattern, we'll end up duplicating this query logic over and over in different places. In situations like this, we can encapsulate this logic in a repository and simply call a method like getTopSellingCourses, which takes 2 parameters, the category and the number of courses to return. So this is one benefit of the pattern. Another benefit of the repository pattern is that it decouples your application from persistence frameworks, in this case Entity Framework. So in the future, if you decide to switch to a different persistence framework, you can do so with minimal impact on the rest of your application. Now, the first argument that comes here is that some developers say, but who would change the persistence framework of an application? Well, let me tell you something. The fact that this does not happen very often is not because it's not desirable. It's because most of the time, application architectures are so tangled and tightly coupled to Entity Framework that it doesn't give us the freedom to change it. A while ago, I read somewhere on a blog that on average every 2 years we get a new persistence framework, and I think that's very true. First we had ADO.NET, so we used SQL connection and SQL command to access the database. Then Link to SQL came along, but it didn't prove to be successful. Next, Entity Framework version 1 arrived, which had so many issues. Nearly at the same time, NHibernate got popular. Then after 4 versions, Entity Framework reached a stage that it was reasonable to be used in production. But still at this point, it had a heavy object model that was not testable. Then they introduced a new model, DB-Context. Now they are working on version 7, which is a complete rewrite, and there are some breaking changes. Not to mention that along these lines, we have had other persistence frameworks like Dapr, ORM Lite, Petapocos, and so on. So our persistent frameworks are constantly changing and evolving. And if you want to have the freedom to explore a different persistence framework with minimal impact in your application, that's when you should use the repository pattern. Now, there is also another benefit with the repository pattern that some claim, that it makes it easier to unit test your application. But that's partially true. And that's if you're using an older version of Entity Framework with object context and object set. The new DB-Context and DB-Set objects have interfaces that you can mock to unit test your applications. So you don't necessarily need the repository pattern to unit test your application. Now, the theory behind what is the repository in practice. In a nutshell, this is what your repositories should look like. They should act like a collection of objects in memory. So we have methods to add or remove an object, get an object by ID, get all objects, or find them using a predicate. Note that here we do not have a method called update. Because with collections in memory, if we want to update an object, we simply get it from the collection and change it. We don't tell the collection to update an object. And that's one of the areas that a lot of developers get wrong. A repository should not have the semantics of your database. It should be like a collection of objects in memory and shouldn't have methods like update and save. Now with this, the first question that pops into a lot of people's head, including myself a long time ago, is if the repository acts as a collection of objects in memory, how are we going to save these objects and changes to them to the database? That's when the unit of work pattern comes into picture. A unit of work maintains a list of objects affected by a business transaction and coordinates the writing out of changes. And this is where things get interesting. Some developers argue that both the repository and unit of work patterns are already implemented in Entity Framework, and there is no need to recreate them, as this would lead to unnecessary complexity. Let's see if this argument is valid. So the argument says that dbset has a collection-like interface. So it has methods like add, remove, find, where, and as you see, it doesn't have methods like update and save. So perfect. Also, the argument claims that the db context acts as the unit of work. It keeps track of changes in the objects and coordinates the writing out of changes. As you see here, a db context has references to one or more db sets, and the save method is actually implemented here. So again, it makes sense because, as I explained, the save method should not be in the repository. Plus, chances are, in a business transaction, we may work with more than one repository. So that's the reason the save method should be in the unit of work. So it will coordinate persisting changes across multiple repositories in one transaction. So, on the surface, yes, Entity Framework DB sets and DB contexts indeed look like repositories and unit of work. But there is a hidden problem here with the implementation of these patterns in Entity Framework. Let's review the benefits of the repository pattern again and see if our DB sets satisfy the definition of repositories. So, a repository minimizes duplicate query logic, and I showed you an example of this before. Now, the problem with dbset and link extension methods implemented on them is that they return iQueryable. And this means if you want to get top selling courses, you will end up repeating these few lines in a few different places in your application. In fact, in one of the projects I worked on recently, this was exactly the case. So DB context was everywhere, and we had long, fat queries repeated over and over. What you see here is actually a very simple example. I've seen worse. So the implementation of dbset does not really help with minimizing duplicate query logic. Yes, you can argue that we can use extension methods to encapsulate this logic into a method in a dbset. And believe me, we had exactly this scenario in that project. In my opinion, this solution treats the symptoms, not the actual problem. Because even if you use extension methods, all the existing link extension methods on dbset still return iQueryable. And next time a developer joining your team is going to use them to write new queries. So in this case, ideally, we want a repository that has a method like get top selling courses. And all this querying logic is encapsulated there. The DB context should be a private field in the repository and not exposed to the outside. It's the implementation detail. Now, the second benefit of repository pattern is that it decouples your application from persistence frameworks. When you're using DB context and DB sets directly in your application is tightly coupled to Entity Framework. If you want to upgrade to a newer version of Entity Framework with a different model, or switch to a different ORM, you need to modify your application code directly. However, if all this is behind a repository and your application code relies on the repository to return the right data, it doesn't matter what is inside the repository. Today, you can use Entity Framework in a repository. Tomorrow, you may decide for optimization reasons to replace it with store procedures. Your application code will not be affected in any way. It simply asks the repository to get the data, and repository does its job. It doesn't matter what's inside the repository, how it's done. Are we using store procedures? Are we using Entity Framework? Are we using object context or DB context or a different ORM? It doesn't matter. So with all these, in my opinion, while DB sets and DB context in Entity Framework do look like the implementation of the repository and unit of work, they don't really bring the architectural benefits that we can get from these patterns. If you have not read about clean architecture, I highly recommend you to look it up. Uncle Bob or Robert C. Martin has a beautiful post on the topic, and my favorite line in that post is, "The architecture should be independent of frameworks." This allows you to use such frameworks as tools rather than having to cram your system into their limited constraints. So that's why using patterns like the repository pattern help you decouple from frameworks such as Entity Framework. Now, the theory aside, I want you to think like an engineer. Be pragmatic. Keep it simple. My favorite quote is that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. Just adhering to clean architecture principles and using all sorts of patterns doesn't necessarily make you a better coder. Neither does it improve the quality of your software. Not every application needs sophisticated architecture like this. A lot of times you might be building simple or proof of concept applications for a limited audience. Please don't do over engineering. A while ago, I worked for 5 months on an application where its requirements were rapidly changing. And there, I didn't use any of the stuff I talked about in this lecture. I had no repositories, no clean architecture, no unit testing, not even dependency injection. Because we were not sure if the application would even make it to the production for financial and political reasons. And guess what? The application never made it to the production. So if I spent a lot of time adhering to all these architectural best practices, I had just wasted my time. It wouldn't bring any values. Some developers simply use patterns without really understanding the problem, and this way they feel good about themselves. My pragmatic suggestion to you is use patterns only when you need to. Don't use them as deodorants to make smelly code smell good. Now in the next lecture, I will show you how to implement the repository and unit of work patterns with any framework. I hope you enjoyed this lecture and thank you for watching.